will be introductory remarks and opening remarks by In Askew, Director of the Sexual and Reproductive Health and Research Department, including special program for research development and research training in human reproduction, HRP, World Health Organization, based headquarters based in Geneva. The floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Igor. And on behalf of WHO and the HRP Special Research Program, I'd like to welcome everyone to the launch of the 6th edition of the WHO Laboratory Manual for the Examination and Processing of Human Semen. I'd like to start by saying that WHO strongly endorses the human right of everyone, everywhere, to have the highest standard of health, including their sexual and reproductive health. All member states around the world have committed to the Sustainable Development Goal for Health, and included within this commitment is SDG 3.7, universal access to sexual and reproductive health services. Universal access must include the laboratory tests and analyses needed to ensure that everyone can easily access high-quality diagnostic and therapeutic services without incurring financial hardship, to avoid the adverse health and socioeconomic consequences of sexual and reproductive ill health. For WHO, the right to the highest standard of reproductive health includes that individuals and couples be able to have the number of children desired and when desired. Achieving this right means being able to access contraceptive services and fertility care services as and when needed. For the past 40 years, the WHO Laboratory Manual for the Examination and Processing of Human Semen has become a recognized and recommended manual for laboratory examinations. As such, it is a key resource for the provision of high-quality, effective services to meet the needs of those individuals and couples who are facing challenges with achieving a pregnancy when desired. The manual has been widely translated and used extensively over the years by clinical and research laboratories throughout the world. For example, the 5th edition, has been downloaded more than 575,000 times and remains one of the most widely used of WHO's technical documents. The manual is regularly revised as new techniques are validated and made available for clinical and research purposes. Following an extensive process of evidence gathering and synthesis, consultation with the world's experts, and a public review of the draft manual, the 6th edition of this key tool is now ready to be launched. This updated manual will help scientists, technicians, laboratory experts, and healthcare workers worldwide to safeguard the quality of the clinical use of human semen in laboratory settings and future research on semen. This edition should also make global comparisons easier for scientists evaluating the methods used in the manual. The updated WHO Laboratory Manual can help to provide information to facilitate the interpretation of the results of semen analysis. However, it is very important to note that it is not a guideline for clinical decisions on treatments for male factor infertility, or for use outside of a laboratory setting. WHO is in the process of developing global guidance on infertility, including both male and female factor infertility, which will provide the evidence-informed interventions to address these conditions. Not everyone attending this launch will be aware that this manual is actually a joint product of WHO and the UN co-sponsored Special Human Reproduction Program, known as HRP. This research program is based within the Sexual and Reproductive Health and Research Department at WHO and is co-sponsored by UNICEF, UNFPA, UNDP, and the World Bank, as well as WHO, with funding from several member states and foundations. We would like to acknowledge the support of HRP in the development of this manual. WHO and HRP would also like to thank the many technical experts from around the world who contributed to the review and revision of this manual. I would like to extend my special thanks to the Editor-in-Chief, Dr. Lars Bjørndal, who you'll be hearing from later, for leading the technical review of the manual, and to Dr. Christina Wong for her outstanding contributions to all 6 editions of the manual. Special thanks are also due to all members of the editorial board and the writing team for their invaluable contributions to the manual, and particularly during this difficult period of teleworking during the COVID-19 pandemic. I'd also like to express our gratitude to the many colleagues who worked on the editing, layout and production of the 6th edition. And personally, I would like to sincerely thank my colleagues Igor Toskin, James Chiari, Carol Blondil, and Nathalie Moret for their tireless efforts and dedication, which has led us to today's event. Once again, welcome everyone, and I'm sure you will find this event extremely useful. I'll now hand over to Igor to introduce the next speaker. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed for the warm welcome in and for motivational speech about the launch of this long-awaited document. So we can go to our next speaker, distinguished guest and speaker, Professor Christina Wong from the School of Medicine, USLA, California, United States of America. As Ian stated, Christina contributed to all 6 editions of the manual since 1980, and her talk will be dedicated to a quick historical overview of the manual, starting from the first edition published in 1980. So Christina, the floor is yours, please.
Thank you, Igor. Next slide. Dr. Alvin Paulson and Dr. Prasad in the 1970s, they were manager as well as the chair of the task force for the regulation of male fertility for the World Health Organization. The two of them recognized the need for standardization of procedures for the examination of human semen and semen cervical mucus interaction as the first passage of the sperm into the female reproductive tract. They held consultations in Barcelona, in Geneva, Hong Kong, Berlin, with 33 participants from Asia, Europe, North and South America. It was a collaborative effort of the WHO, HLP, task forces on the methods for the regulation of male fertility, the diagnosis and treatment of infertility, and the vaginal and cervical devices for fertility regulation. Next slide. They did not recognize, maybe they do, that this WHO manual for the examination of and processing of human semen, as Dr. Askew has mentioned, is recognized as providing global standards and used extensively for clinical and research laboratories for the diagnosis and treatment of the infertile couple, assessing spermatogenesis suppression following male fertility regulation, and also for conducting large-scale studies on effects of potential environmental and other toxins on male reproduction. Next slide. In 1980, the first edition of the so-called semen manual was published. The manual has only 6 pages on semen analysis, focusing on the important points of sperm density, motility, and morphology. It provided stains and plates for morphology and also introduced a standardized form for semen analysis. The sperm cervical mucus interaction occupy 8 pages and talk about the in vivo postcoital test, as well as the in vitro capillary test and slide test. They also introduced a term normality for men, and that defined that normality of semen parameters should be obtained from men whose partners were currently pregnant or who had a history of recent fertility. The editorial board consists of Dr. Rune Eliasson from Sweden, an expert on semen analysis, Dr. Mogesi, who is the expert on cervical mucus, as well as Dr. Paulson, expert on semen analysis and clinical diagnosis of male infertility, as well as Drs. Prasad, Balsi, and Gallegos from the World Health Organization teams. Next slide. The second edition, the third and the fourth edition are really the work of Dr. Jeffrey Waits, who was task force manager of the World Health Organization on the methods on regulation of male fertility when the WHO was leading all the efforts in developing both reversible and non-reversible methods of male contraception. The three manuals that was published in 1987, 1992, and 1999 were supported by numerous andrology workshops, both clinical and semen analysis that were held in Africa, Asia, and Eastern Europe. The next slide. In 1987, the manual was used mainly for the evaluation of infertile couple and assessment of men whose sperm suppression is suppressed by potential male contraception or toxic agents. The manual was divided in two parts: the standard part, which was already in the 1980 manual, and the introduction of optional tests, semen culture, biochemical tests of the accessory glands of male reproduction, the sonar-free hamster oocyte test as a test for sperm fertilizing capacity, sperm antibody test, how to recover sperm from the semen using a swim-up technique, as well as detailed analysis of the importance of immature sperm, immature germ cells. A special section were introduced for the sperm antibody test and the semen biochemistry. Importantly, next slide, they define that there should be normal values for semen variables and suggest that each laboratory develop normal ranges for men who achieve a pregnancy within a past 12 years. You will see that this took a long time to happen. But they based this on studies that were done a long time ago in the 1950s and 60s, that these should be, quote, the normal values of semen variable, including a semen volume of over 2 mils, sperm concentration of 20 million, total sperm count of 40, total motility that are progressive of 50, and a morphology of 50%, and a viability of about 50%. Next slide. In 1992, the World Health Organization task force on the regulation of male fertility responded to the needs at that time because of the advance in the techniques of assisted reproductive technology, and also the recognition that the environmental pollution may have effects on male fertility. This manual in 1992 was linked to the World Health Organization manual for the standardized investigation and diagnosis of the infertile couple, which is being revised. And this manual had led to a controversy because at this time, the assessment of sperm morphology was not unified. It was the old-fashioned method of assessing any sperm that looked normal under the microscope as normal. Therefore, the normal sperm morphology of 50% to the strict criteria introduced in South Africa, where the sperm has to be perfectly normal, shape, size, and to be qualified as normal sperm. Therefore, at this time, and you will see also in the next manual, the normal morphology here was defined arbitrarily as 30%, stating that the empirical reference value was introduced without clinical studies to support the value. This led to a lot of controversy and criticism of this manual. Next slide. However, this manual in fact introduced the three different parts of the manual: the standard methods that I spoke about, the optional methods, and also the research tests, the sperm function test, including the sonar-free hamster egg, the human sonar-palooza binding test, and the acrosome reaction, as well as introduction of the computer-assisted sperm analysis as tests for research. The sperm preparation techniques was grossly expanded, and the introduction of the importance of quality control in an andrology lab, as well as safety procedures and the basic requirements of an andrology lab, which is introduced in 1992 and is present in the current manual. Next slide. The fourth edition is essentially the same. The manual is divided into 3 parts. In the optional part, we added the multiple sperm defects index and the hyperosmotic swelling test, which is very easy to do. In the research test, we introduced the reactive oxygen species, as you will see later on, is a marker of damages to the sperm DNA. Extends and that the quality control methods now included methods, practical methods of how to implement quality control in an andrology laboratory, and also included statistical analysis and consideration of counting errors. The reference range was stated very, very clearly that it should not be used as the lower semen value compatible with fertility for in vivo and in vitro. And the percentage normal morphology at that time, it was suggested to be 15%, but suggested that this is in progress and we don't have evidence-based data. Next slide. The 5th edition that was published now over 10 years ago is the most extensive revision and the most comprehensive edition of the manual. The 5th edition provided lots of details. Some of them are really very useful. However, because it introduced alternate methods, examples, notes, comments, and boxes, and the manual doubled in the number of pages, more than double the number of pages, that sometimes in the laboratories, technicians will find it very difficult to follow. It included, importantly, that we should include total sperm per ejaculate as a very important parameter for fertility. And it provided methods to measure very, very low sperm counts, and also the errors when you are reporting azoospermia, the errors that's associated with that report. It also includes all new morphology plates and new procedures for sperm extraction, now not only from the semen, but from the testes and epididymis, because of the introduction of new techniques, assisted reproductive techniques that is in the clinic. It developed a section of trial preservation of sperm, which is really important for fertility preservation, and updated the methods of quality control and assurance. Most importantly, next slide, it quoted the reference ranges and limits, and this time based on evidence-based data from 400 and 1900 fertile men whose partners at the time to pregnancy of less than 12 months, and used statistical analysis of one-sided 5% as the lower reference limit. The publication by Cooper et al. From using the WHO reference value for semen analysis is one of the most quoted publication on male reproduction. Next slide. These are the values that was published in the from the 5th edition of the so-called normal values. Nowadays should be called the reference ranges, and shown in purple are the values that are evidence-based, showing a semen volume should be probably above 1.5, 39 total sperm count, 15 million per mil as the sperm concentration. Progressive motility should be over 32%, viability over 58%, and normal forms using the very strict criteria of 4%. These data are reference ranges and should not be used again for definition of fertility in vivo or in vitro. Next slide. The next slide shows all the 5 versions of the manual until today. The World Health Organization Semen Manual is the gold standard for semen analysis throughout the world. It's one of the most downloaded publication of the World Health Organization, and I'm proud and humbled to be associated with all 6 editions of the Semen Manual. Thank you.
Yeah, Christina, thank you very much indeed for this very interesting, fascinating overview of the all previous 5 editions, and particularly accentuating on the key aspects that were reflected in each edition according to the development and the technology and understanding of the needs for the semen examination and processing. According to a retrospective review of the statistics of WHO that we completed recently, we can confirm that all these editions generated a lot of interest in the professional community, and all these editions were permanently among the most demanded, downloaded, distributed WHO documents. That confirms again how this document is important for the field, for the colleagues working in the sexual and reproductive health. Thank you indeed, Christina, for fascinating talk. So we are going to our next distinguished speaker, my dear colleague, Dr. James Chiari. James Chiari is the head of the Contraception and Fertility Care Unit of the same department, Sexual and Reproductive Health and Research Department of the Health World Organization, Geneva. And James will talk about the manual in general and 6th edition of the manual, particularly in the context of the fertility care. So James, the floor is yours, please.
Thank you very much, Igor. And it's also a pleasure for me to join everyone at this launch of the manual. And for me, I would really like to emphasize from where Professor Wong left about the importance of having a gold standard for semen analysis and also for processing semen. My main message for my presentation is that the manual should not be seen only in the context of infertility, but it has many applications within fertility care and contraception. I will highlight its uses both in clinical and research setting for investigating infertility and also for fertility preservation and also in male contraception. And also I will talk a bit about how well the manual fits into the other work that we are doing within WHO on fertility care. As many of you are aware, this is an area that has not received as much public health attention as it deserves, and we would like to really call out that this area receives more attention, and in this way, the semen manual is actually a very important product from our department. And next slide. So in terms of investigating infertility, we know that infertility is commonly actually blamed on the female partner, but we know that it can also have male causes or it could be unexplained. Analyzing and proper processing of semen is actually at the center of identifying what is the cause of infertility. And without this being done properly, then it will not be possible for us to properly manage infertile couples. And it's very important for us, and we are very excited to see that this manual is being used globally, that we actually have comparable results. Because we know that many times clients with infertility are treated in one facility and then in another facility. They are also evaluated from time to time. And for these results to be comparable, it's very good for us that we have the semen manual from WHO that can be used as a gold standard. So whichever lab is doing the testing then gets similar results. So on the next slide, I would like to talk a bit about fertility preservation. Our understanding of fertility has really progressed a lot in the last 15 to 20 years. We have better understanding of the role of semen, sperm, how we can store over. And now it is actually possible for patients that are undergoing treatment procedures like chemotherapy, radiation, or hormone therapy, or any other intervention that may affect future fertility, to be able to preserve their semen and sperm that can be later used for reproduction. And this is a very important advance in science and in technology. But for it really to bear the results that we want, it is very important that we adhere to these standards that have been set out for processing humans' semen. So this issue of sperm preparation and cryopreservation will not be possible if we do not have these procedures, and if as a global community we do not adopt these standards of processing human semen. And finally, the other area I wanted to highlight on the next slide is on the issue of contraception. Although female contraception or female methods of contraception are the most commonly used, there is increasing interest in male contraception. And even today, about 25% of couples using contraception are actually relying on a male method of contraception, be it vasectomy, be it condoms, or even traditional methods such as withdrawal. And particularly for vasectomy, semen analysis is critical for us to be able to detect whether the procedure has been effective. And this will not be possible if we do not adopt the procedures as outlined in this manual, for us to be able to conclusively say that sperm is absent or is still present when we are evaluating men who have had vasectomy. And currently, there's actually ongoing greater efforts to develop new methods of reversible male contraception. These methods are either hormonal methods that suppress spermatogenesis, or even reversible occlusion of the vas. These are methods that are not yet available, but are under development. The evaluation of semen will be really critical in monitoring these methods during use, and has also been invaluable in the research that has gone on in the development of these methods. So we should not see this manual as something that is only useful for infertility treatment. It is a manual that is very useful in various areas of fertility care, and also in research. And next slide. So I will highlight two things that we are doing in the department in the area of fertility care, for which we think that this manual will be very a core tool. One, we are in the process of developing guidelines on the prevention, diagnosis, and management of infertility. The goal of these guidelines will be to provide guidance on this prevention, diagnosis, and treatment of infertility, so as to improve the standard of care globally, and particularly with a focus of low resource settings. We know that infertility is one area that has received very little attention, and millions of couples are actually suffering because they are not able to access care, and even when they access, the standard of care tends to be not appropriate. I will not go through the specific objectives of these guidelines, but overall, they are following the process, which is evidence-based, the GRADE process that we use here in WHO. We have about 35 PICO questions that will be addressed. And because these are the first guidelines, it is quite an engaging process And we are really looking excitedly that towards the end of this year or early next year, we'll actually be able to issue the first WHO guidelines on prevention, diagnosis, and management of infertility. For you to implement these guidelines and for us to implement these guidelines, of course, the semen manual will be at the core in terms of evaluating infertile men and infertile couples. Therefore, this will be something that will be very important for us to keep an eye out for, and for which we anticipate that the semen manual will actually provide critical additional support. And on the next slide, the last issue I just wanted to highlight that we are working on is the estimates of the prevalence of infertility. And we know that infertility is a global health issue. It's affecting millions of people of reproductive age. But we are not very confident in terms of how many people are actually affected by this issue. And therefore, it has been sometimes not as great a focus of attention. And I think, as Ian raised at the beginning, that it is the right of all men, women, and couples to be able to access their rights to health, including their reproductive, sexual reproductive health rights. And this includes the prevention, the diagnosis, and the management of infertility. And we need to be able to understand whether the interventions we are putting in place are working, which will not be possible without us getting a better understanding. The use of the semen manual will help us a lot to better understand, beyond the big numbers of how many are affected, to better understand what is the etiology, and also to shed light on the relative contribution of various factors, and to be able to understand whether there are trends that are seen over time, and some of the reasons for these trends if we observe them. So it will be really complement this work of estimates that we are doing, and that we anticipate that at the end of this year we'll be releasing at least the global and regional estimates of infertility to further refine these estimates that we have. And next slide. Yeah, so I would like to end there and hand over to Igor to introduce the next presenter. Thank you very much.
Dear James, thank you very much indeed for this comprehensive overview and positioning the manual, including 6th edition of the manual within context of fertility care, as well as within context of the ongoing work in our department and in WHO on sexual and reproductive health. And so eloquently explaining what the potential role and utility of this manual, not only in terms of the clinical aspects, but also the strategic information gathering for assessing the infertility burden and all other aspects that we are prioritizing in terms of the reproductive health, and particularly male reproductive health in WHO. Thank you very much indeed. So we are moving to the set of the presentations related directly to the 6th edition of the manual. And the first speaker who will give a presentation on the 6th edition, it's editor-in-chief of this edition, Dr. Lars Björndal from Karolinska University Institute, Sweden, Stockholm. And I would like once again to acknowledge the outstanding contribution by Lars to this 6th edition, having a leading role in the technical development of the 6th edition. So Lars, the floor is yours, and Lars will walk us through the main aspects of the 6th edition, particularly what is new comparing to the 5th edition. Lars, please.
Thank you very much. First, I would like to thank the entire editorial committee for all our constructive discussions leading towards this, leading forward towards this revised edition of the manual. I came first into the work into the WHO Semen Manual 16 years ago. Please go back. And I also would like to extend my thanks to Igor Toskin and Karel Blondel for all their work to keep the editorial committee, and especially myself, on track to get this done. Okay, so the outline of the presentation is to first present very short what is kept, what is new, what is discarded. And then I will spend some time on the matter of limits. We have already heard from Christina Wong about that, and we will hear more from Christopher Barrett. And I will also mention a little about the matter of standardization, which also have been touched upon on the earlier presentation. But in the editorial committee, we found these matters very important and have had long and good discussions about that. Next, please. So what is kept? Well, the best techniques based on laboratory science, the basic semen examination has not really been changed very much, but it's more like housekeeping to try to make the text even easier for lab staff to follow. We have done the extended analysis. We have made some changes between basic or earlier called standard analysis and extended analysis. And finally, we have also research tests, those that are described as a help for laboratories wanting to expand and do more. And if we go back, please, the basic semen examination, that is what we would say is what every laboratory doing semen analysis should be able to do. Extended analysis, I will explain a little why we have shifted some over to extended. They are as best described as we can find it, but there may be difficulties in interpreting how much value it is in each of these. And also with the research test, we have provided that as a help for laboratories to find their way, but there may still be much of improvement in the two latter parts of the manual. So next, please. So what we have done difference in the basic is to recommend more clearly one procedure, and that is for the sake of standardization. And that means that there are fewer investigations within the basic section. We had discussions and where we found that the scientific evidence for clinical value of certain assessment is weaker than the tradition to do it because we have always done it. Then we moved that to the extended examination to those who want to do that, how should it be done in the best way? Next. So the basic examination, main methods, examples, and explanations are more separated. It turned out when we tested with the lab staff members that it was difficult to follow the procedures because there were so many examples and explanations within the procedure description. And it was not always the most logical order. So when in principle, we kept everything in concentration. For motility, we have returned to the former 4-category categorization, and that is rapid, slow, non-progressive, and immotile. If there is a demand, there is no interest in distinguishing between rapid and slow progressive sperm, then of course it's possible to do only that. But there is scientific evidence for clinical value of detecting absence of rapid progressive sperm, both to understand infertility in vivo and for probable problem with ordinary IVF, so that ICSI could be the best choice for couples where the man's sperm actually are moving very slowly forward. I should also mention that it's not a matter that people in the lab must be able to set the exact speed of all sperm. It's just to distinguish between rapid and slow. For vitality, the recommendation is you don't have to do that on all samples, because the most simple way to determine vitality is to look at the motility. If a sperm is motile, then it's alive. So only if there are very few motile, then vitality test is important to see how many sperm are immotile and alive and how many are immotile and dead. And based on scientific reports, there is no need for replicate assessments. For morphology, the WHO has recommended, the manual has recommended the Tigerberg strict criteria using staining primarily by the sperm-adapted Papanicolaou staining, and that remains. And there is more stress on morphology to not only look for head abnormalities, which is quite common with these strict criteria. It's also important to look if the tails are abnormal, if there is a problem in the midpiece, and so on. And it's the same thing there. The most important is to know the criteria well. Replicate assessment is not required. Next, please. So, examples, what goes beyond the basic examination. Sperm DNA damage or sperm DNA fragmentation, markers for genital tract inflammation, sequence of ejaculation, semen biochemistry, anti-sperm antibodies, and indices of multiple sperm defects, and also sperm aneuploidy assessment. Among research procedures, we have oxidative stress, acrosome reaction, sperm chromatin structure and stability, cat spur channels, CASA, that is the of course the computer-assisted sperm analysis. And also we have kept and tried to develop the sperm preparation techniques, cryopreservation of spermatozoa, and the chapter on quality assurance and quality control. I know that from giving many courses in basic semen analysis has created lots of worries in laboratories and among laboratory staff members. And we have tried to make it more fluent in describing and taking away lots of mathematical description and trying to describe in word how you calculate a number of important measures of quality. So hopefully it will be easier to follow that for people who are not specialists in statistics and so on. Next, please. What is discarded then? Well, we discussed about the sperm cervical penetration test and decided not to include it anymore because we found that it is used in very few places, and the earlier manuals could provide the information. We have actually nothing new about that. We also excluded the hamster egg penetration test, but even stronger on that. It's not at all of the same interest as it was many years ago when that was supposed and thought to be a useful test before going to IVF. Yes, next, please. Then a few words on the matter of limits. For the interpretation of results, of course, limits between normal and pathology are essential. The problem here for semen examination is that there are no real distinct limits. And I would say, as Christina Wong also showed, that earlier simple reference limits are often misunderstood. And we could take this as a starting point. Distribution of data from reference men in reference populations. They don't represent limits between fertile and subfertile. And I will give some examples why it is like this. One, the reference population is actually mixed. Time to conception of 12 months or less, that will actually include men with semen quality issues, but the couples that manage to have a conception within 12 months, they are of course lucky and we can congratulate them, but the reference population is not completely well defined there. And it will also exclude men with longer or no time to conception and still having good semen, because, well, the time to conception also depends on the female. And there are also some interesting studies, some old and some very new. The shorter time to conception, the better semen characteristics. Well, already in 1968, Titzer showed that 80% of couples who stopped contraception would have a conception within 4 months. And the remaining 20% who had the conception used so many more months. And Kehani this year published that shorter time to conception was present when semen was much better than the lower 5th percentile, showing that the difference earlier shown then, that we have a reference population with up to 12 months time to conception will include men with, actually, it's quite likely that there will be men with lower semen analysis results included in that group. Okay, number 2. Next, please. We should also remember that semen examination has different goals. We should think about it like assessment of male reproductive organ function. We could have follow-up of andrological treatment of the man. And as James Kerr talked about, assessment of male contraceptive treatments. And one important aspect is still a choice of assisted reproductive treatment modality. But all these different goals would have different limits of interest. When is that? And I had the last one, epidemiological and environmental studies, where you want to see the influence of external factors. Then you should not only go for this lower 5th percentile, it's other aspect that probably is more important. So, next slide. Decision limits are in many cases more useful than those reference limits based on reference population data. So when clinical investigations are essential to discover, for instance, endocrine or genetic disorders, that is an important decision limit. How low should the sperm count be before you start doing these examinations? They are usually, the genetic tests are usually quite expensive. So it shouldn't be done on all men, but when is it really likely to find that? And also to decide if clinical interventions are sufficient. In Stockholm, we treat lots of men with hypogonadism, and we actually use sperm production as a measurement of when the clinical interventions are sufficient, even if the men are not interested in children or a child at that time, but we take that as a measurement of the function of his organs. And of course, another decision limit, when is it useful, which treatment would be most optimal for IVF or ICSI. And also to other decision limits, when do external factors actually influence sperm production and sperm function? And I would say we need these, we need information to develop decision limits for these different uses of semen analysis. So global standardization is necessary for the development of andrology and reproductive medicine. It's necessary to generate new diagnoses and new treatments. We have to, well, that means that since many of these causes, etiologies, can be quite scarce in one region or one country or one town, it's important that we can use data and information from different centers, multi-center studies. And then it's absolutely necessary to have comparable methods. And that is also the case if we want to implement techniques and limits developed in other centers. If we don't use the same standardized techniques, it's useless. And I would say, without robust data, any scientific investigation will not reveal true pathology. If we have very poor robustness among data, we can actually miss out important correlations. And therefore, I also say misinterpreted limits will not disclose factors of importance for infertility. Okay, next, please. So, conclusions. The new edition, basic examination of semen focused on stepwise procedures, evidence-based techniques, support. It's actually supported by a new formal ISO standard that is the same as for the basic examination. And if we go back to, so I can, there are the decision limits that need to be developed. But we should remember that, and I support fully, this standardization is needed for the development of andrology and reproductive medicine, standardization of laboratory techniques. Next, please. So I've been giving similar presentations, not on the WHO 6th edition, but semen examination is not only related to fertilization success in vivo or in vitro. I would say it's necessary for the proper investigation of male reproductive functions in many different situations. Thank you.
Lars, thank you very much indeed for so clear presentation on the main elements of the 6th edition, particularly development reflected in this edition since the previous edition. It's important to know that your presentation reflects very hard work of the editorial board and all contributors to this edition in terms of gathering evidence, assessment of evidence, synthesis of the evidence, and finally describing this in the 6th edition. And you did so eloquently. So thank you very much indeed for this. And we are moving to our next distinguished speaker. It's Professor Christopher Barrett. Christopher Barrett from the University of Dundee, United Kingdom. And Chris will give a talk on the distribution of the semen examination results, new findings, main challenges, and way forward. These reflected and presented in the 6th edition, and Chris will walk us through the main aspects of chapter 8, where in fact these elements of the manual are described. So Chris, thank you indeed, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Igor. Thank you very much also to the committee and for inviting me to give the presentation today. First of all, it's important to say that it's been a true pleasure being part of this editorial committee over the last 3 years. It's a fantastic privilege to be part of such a great initiative. I don't have any significant conflicts of interest that would change the way I would discuss the data with you today. 100% of my salary comes from the University of Dundee in Scotland. The next slide, please. So I'm going to go through today a little bit about the distribution of the parameters for semen analysis based on one population. I'm going to give some details about the context of that, and perhaps then with the challenges and the way forward, hopefully set up a nice discussion at the end. The next slide, please. So the full information related to the distribution of semen examination is presented in a paper from Martin Campbell, which was published in Andrology, and here's the reference for those of you are interested in the primary data. The next slide, please. So as mentioned, there's been 5 previous editions of the manual from 1980 to 2010, and they've been hotly discussed and hotly debated, and they are very popular in downloads and in your local bookstores. What's the important thing in the context of what I'm talking about today, for the next slide, please, is that the 5th edition from 2010 was the primary edition which contained comprehensive data to support what was then described as the reference values in Chapter 8. And this was the first time that the WHO basically obtained large information related to these semen analysis parameters. And this slide contains the data from Trevor Cooper and colleagues, which was published in Human Reproduction Update in 2010, which is the basis, of course, for the reference ranges for semen analysis parameters. And what this shows under the blue arrow is the full centiles, and the 5th centile is represented as what's deemed to be the lower reference range. And for semen volume, that was 1.5, for sperm concentration was 15, etc., etc. And these are largely used throughout the world and are part of the 5th edition of the Semen Analysis Manual. Next slide, please. So the question then came for us as an editorial committee, is this sufficient to use, just use again? Or do we actually need to obtain extra information if the extra information is in fact available? It was noted that the original analysis, which was from the WHO, published by first author being Trevor, was actually a reference population using standardized methods, where there's 2 to 7 days sexual abstinence, and it covered about 8 countries from 3 continents. However, the last publication in there was prior to 2010, and we felt that actually there may be some extra data that we could add to that information to see how robust these distributions were. So we updated the literature as of 2020. We did a classic literature search, which contained time to pregnancy of less than 12 months, in vivo conception, the data collected as per the WHO 5th edition, and obviously this is for patients, so there's no infertility patients or patients attending a clinic. So the classic what's termed to be fertile men. The data was collected up till October 2019, and the primary author was Martin, who got a lot of this data together. In addition to that, we did a citation search, primarily based on the Cooper paper, because this is, as Christina's mentioned, a highly cited paper, 1,500 plus citations. And then we searched the literature, and we're looking for data and papers published really as related to the fertile man. The next slide, please. So we identified a number of studies actually, but once we'd whittled this down significantly, there was only 5 studies where we could verify a lot of the information. And we contacted the author, and the authors had agreed to give us Excel spreadsheets, basically provide all the data to us. And that was important for us because we wanted to analyze all the data together. And we had a number of questions regarding methods used, recruitment, etc. So you will see that these new studies and new data sets come from Italy, Iran, Egypt, China, and Greece, and the reference contained in the publication is presented there. And those authors very, very kindly provided the data to us, and it's a great privilege to be part of such a network where people are so generous to do that. The next slide, please. So we also obtained the original data, which was used for the 2010 reference ranges and distributions, and that was provided kindly by the WHO editorial committee. And the hypothesis and the idea was to bring these 2 data sets together to then see if there are any updates and any differences over the last periods. Next slide, please. So now we can see that the two here data sets contain different distributions related to their origin. So different studies, for example, some come from Australia, some come from the United States. The new data sets come from China, Iran as an example. So there's a much wider spread of the data geographically, and the numbers, of course, are significantly increased. So all of this data comes together to produce the new distributions. Next slide, please. So this is the table 3 from Martin's primary data paper. And what we have here is you can see the N values related to semen volume, sperm concentration, sperm number, etc. And here is the distribution of those information. And the 5th center, which is the same as presented, for example, in Trevor's paper. And we see here that the values are 1.4, 16 million sperm per mil, 42% total motility, 30% progressive motility. There's no real difference between the values as they were presented in the 2010 manual. But of course, excuse me, but of course, there's a larger database present here. So the next slide, please. So what does all this mean for us? Why are we getting excited, and why should we pay any attention to this? What does it really mean? Well, first of all, I think it's a larger number of subjects, and allowing a larger number of subjects gives us more confidence really in the data that's being collected on the distribution in this particular group. There's a larger number of countries, there's a larger number of continents. So in theory, it's a more global representation of the so-called fertile male. There's some data now from China and Africa as an example. I think very importantly, the committee were very keen that actually the data was freely available, to add to scrutinize, to discuss, to change, to whatever. And that's available Martin's made that available at the University of Dundee website, where the Excel spreadsheet is instantly downloadable. So you can see the primary data that we use that is of course available for you. Hopefully that data continually can be added to, and then we can see how that might change your observations. So, and the other thing which I thought was really very warm and very comforting was the fact that the distribution of values that we see is pretty much exactly the same as what it was in 2010. And that gives us some real high confidence that the data is relatively robust. And it's consistent, of course, with the literature over the last sort of 30 or 40 years. However, I think there are some caveats and some lessons that we need to learn. I was incredibly surprised, actually, at the low number of studies that we could access. To only add 5 studies over a period of 11 years struck me as just, it was just really low. I was really surprised. When we were discussing this internally, I just couldn't believe that there were so few studies. Okay, so there were some studies we couldn't use for various reasons. One of the authors had died, for example, we couldn't access the data. But even so, the low numbers of studies were very, very surprising to me. And also they're regionally very restricted. You know, we don't have any high quality data, or we hadn't at that time, from South America, for example. We only have one country in Africa, that's Egypt. You know, that doesn't represent all of Africa, or at least we need to determine if that does represent all of Africa. So I think there are many questions with regard to that. And I think, as Lars has mentioned, and as all of us have mentioned to you today, it's very important that we have robust methods to analyze data. And in fact, sometimes it's very difficult for us to determine what methods had actually been used, even though they'd said they used the WHO methods. When we drilled into that, it was quite difficult to find out exactly what had been done. And openness, transparency, and detailed methods would really help us in that arena. And I think that's important to take home message. The next slide, please. So just to give you some context, I wanted to give 2 context points. Number 1 is to reiterate, and hopefully that you're quite now well aware now, that although these are distributions of the fertile male, in vivo pregnancies, etc., there is tremendous overlap between different groups. And of course, this is a paper from MacLeod and Gould in the 1950s, in 1951 actually. So that's a large number of years ago. And we can see that the distributions, although they're actually statistically different, there's a substantial overlap between them. So actually that's a very important point that we've made continually, I think, too. The next slide, please. I think the second context for semen analysis, which we sort of haven't talked about yet, which is up for discussion, is increasingly we're starting to understand that, for example, men with subfertility live sicker and die younger than normal men. And these are examples from Michael Eisenberg from the United States, where there's been a lot of, he's done a lot of investigations with his colleagues and teams, in fact, around the world, looking at this as a relationship between subfertility, semen analysis, and potential morbidity, and in fact, mortality. And I think as we understand more, we'll understand that doing a semen analysis may actually take a different slant. And as Lars and the team have mentioned, it's not just looking at prognosis and diagnosis, there are many other aspects to a semen analysis. And I think a high quality semen analysis may in fact be a sentinel marker of health. The next slide, please. So what does this bring us for the future? Now we've had some context, where are we going to go in the future? Well, I think it's essential that we have large prospective studies on very clearly defined populations, in fact, from geographically and culturally diverse backgrounds and locations, and in fact, related to economic regions. The paucity of data in this area is really, really restricting a lot of what we can do. And as Lars has mentioned, it'd be very important to also have different detailed backgrounds on this, these particular, you know, how can we then look for wild deletions, etc., etc. And I think at the same time, we have to realize that we have to, all of us combine together to actually try and get these studies off the ground. In theory, you should have prospective studies continually ongoing that can be added to and developed. And I see no reason why we can't do this in reproductive medicine. You know, we've seen from the last 18 months how powerful a global approach to dealing with medical issues can be. And I think we've got to learn by that and actually try and develop those global approaches. And I'm very privileged with Chris and colleagues to be part of a global initiative to look at male reproductive health. And I think part of that is trying to get us to understand what the challenges are and doing studies and initiating these long-term prospective studies, which will substantially help us to identify and look at information in the future. But of course, technology doesn't stand still, thankfully. Technological developments may actually complement or in fact change part of the way we do semen analysis in 2030. So when the editorial board sitting down in 2029 or whatever, maybe there's lots of technical changes that have happened to actually push the personalized medicine agenda. The different technology for looking at sperm, for example, may then help us in the future to actually look at ways of doing semen analysis slightly differently. So I think 2030 holds some really fantastic promise and excitement for data sets and information. The next slide, please. So in closing, I would like to just acknowledge the part that's played. This is a picture of Wee Martin. Martin's been instrumental in driving and the force behind getting this data in the project. I'm really grateful for him to do that. I'm also grateful for the WHO for obtaining the primary data. And that was just fantastic to be able to do that. And to reiterate again, for people who provide us with the Excel spreadsheets for our data and the studies that are done, without them, we could not have got these distributions. And I want to thank them publicly. Thank you very much for doing that. It's been a tremendous privilege to be working with you over them. Thank you very much, Iger and Lars.
Yeah, Chris, thank you very much indeed for very clear, concise presentation on the new findings within context of the distribution of the semen examination results, particularly making the focus on the purpose of the data included in the 6th edition based on the review that you co-leaded and co-coordinated. And I would like to thank you once again for taking this role in the publication that was used, in fact, for this specific chapter in the 6th edition. And special thanks for emphasizing the main challenges and probably the way forward to address the existing data gap in this field, and particularly emphasizing the needs for possibly globally representative prospective study. It's extremely important, and this thinks us about what we have to do in the future. Thank you indeed, Chris. And with that, we are moving to our next and final presentation, formal presentation in our webinar, which will be co-presented by two colleagues, Professor Stefan Schlatt from the Münster University, Germany. It's a WHO collaborating center, and Professor Mario Festin from the University of Philippines, Manila College of the Medicine and the Philippine General Hospital. As well, Mario is a former colleague of the Sexual and Reproductive Health and Research Department and HRP. So Mario and Stefan will talk about practical consideration for the end users of the 6th edition. Stefan, Mario, the floor is yours, please.
Thank you very much, Igor. And I'd like to say hello to my friend and colleague, Stefan. And I think I could say that it is a very exciting time, because we are finally launching the 6th edition of the WHO Semen Manual.
Yes, hello, Mario. Indeed, it is very exciting. It was a real pleasure, and we were thinking about it, how to start the whole process. And when we met 2017 in Copenhagen, I think that was a really good start, because it was a rather small meeting, but it was a very intense meeting, and we could get started there and had many thoughts about the next version of the manual.
Yes, it was my first time to attend the International Congress of Andrology. And as a WHO staff member at that time, I was very happy and surprised that the Semen Manual was a very important document that was being cited as a reference in almost every lecture, and almost every talk had given reference to the manual. I was very proud and happy, but was also very much impressed at how much everybody was citing and using the manual.
Indeed, it is true. And until today, the reference which you just heard a few times about from Trevor Cooper in Human Reproduction Update from 2010 is very heavily quoted. And the Semen Manual is almost present in every andrology paper until today. So it is an amazing, amazing document. Do you know what the performance of the manual was in terms of a WHO perspective?
Oh, I think Ian mentioned it and a few others during this evening's talk or this afternoon's talk, that it is one of the most popular and most downloaded documents in the WHO website. Over 575,000 downloads over the past 10 years. What also impressed me, it has been translated into many languages, into German, Italian, Portuguese, Russian, Turkish, Chinese, and Japanese. We usually translate into French and Russian, but we have to check whether those versions exist. And I know that as we are talking, already there are plans to translate the 6th edition into at least the French and Spanish. So, and as mentioned, it is still widely quoted and referenced in many of the papers now in andrology, even if the edition, the 5th edition came out 11 years ago. So I'm very much impressed about how popular and how widely used the Semen Manual is.
Indeed, our center as a collaboration center had the task to translate it into German, and it was quite tough because I had to do the statistics part, which was even difficult in any language for me, but it was true fun to do that. And the German version became a real book, so you could buy the book and was a complete sellout in between. So it was quite impressive to see that, and even the Germans had to go back to the downloadable version in the English, and that for some time was quite amazing. But do you think that this has really spread into developing countries? And have you heard stories how it was used?
Yes, So when I was going around, usually in Asia and Africa, the manual is being used by some small laboratories to ensure that the procedures they are doing for the assessment of the semen or the male fertility are being done correctly and properly. What is also good is that the manual also describes the reagents and the equipment that need to be used for the procedures. So if you are operating a small laboratory, you could already get the reagents and the equipment that you need to purchase and to procure so that you would be getting only the essential things you need. You don't have to spend so much more. And also the quality aspect in the procedures. Because there is a quality control chapter, and that there are also the procedures being described in the various sections, the laboratories use it to ensure quality based on the different material found in the book. And this is very important for them, especially if they're using it for certification processes. And to make sure that the laboratories adhere to these safety standards and to the high quality standards, they have to cite a reference why they are doing such procedures that way. And also, if you're a small laboratory and you want to expand, you would be able to read the advanced procedures and the research procedures so that you would be able to read it, learn about it, and use it in order to prepare and to advance for scale up. But so that's how the developing countries are using it. But I know that from your center in Munster that you have also used the manual in training. And I know that there are many attendees to this course, and which your center has offered this course for many, many years. As we have heard, the 6th edition has new practical recommendations, which are partly going back to the previous descriptions in the earlier versions of the manual that we have heard about today. Do you see any needs for training programs like the Quadega or the UK NECWAS to adopt and change their training programs?
I think that's a very good question. And it was always true that when the new version of the manual appeared, that the adoption to these new rules and guidelines was following quickly. So indeed, the manual is physically present in all of the labs and in all of our working places. So that's, of course, then the baseline of where we all start. And I think the training programs should now have the new version on their desks and train according to the new guidelines and the new recommendations. On the other hand, there is not so much difference. I think what we did, we checked validity, we checked practicalities in our editorial board, and we tried to make sometimes even easier recommendation and sometimes even more practical recommendations. So I think that standardization should be easily achievable. I think what is also very important, we were of the opinion that technicians are still superior to purely digital systems. So I think we include a chapter on digital systems, but we will really like to train technicians throughout the world that the same standard is followed in all countries. And I think in that respect, this is a wonderful manual, and that we can really train from that manual all of the very highly qualified technicians. So that will be a task. Of course, it's very encouraging that as we heard from Chris in the previous talk, the thresholds and limits for most endpoints are quite stable, and they even got reconfirmed. So it's encouraging and motivating to the trainers that they can teach this recommendations now, and that they can really have a wonderful quality program, which will lead to comparable data throughout the world for the next coming years. What will be important, perhaps also for the various societies in the andrology field, is that we train the trainers in the next couple of years. It will be an important task so that we take this new recommended values and this new recommended procedures and train the trainers that we have the same standard throughout the world.
Yeah, that's very interesting. And you could see the potential of the manual for many, many aspects. That includes the service provision, the preparation for quality assurance within the laboratory, and for expansion. And when we were discussing the plans for the new edition, we know that the manual provides a very good guidance for the highest global standards in sperm analysis. And we can actually lead, this could actually lead to a harmonization and for all the various procedures. But since we are looking forward to the future, and Chris has mentioned that a little bit, do you see any methodological breakthroughs which may be in the horizon that may be implemented for the 7th edition? So we're just launching the 6th, and we are beginning to talk already about the 7th. And this will be coming in the following years.
I mean, we all know that, that there was a lot of development, and Christina showed that very nicely over the many years. And the manual is at a point where we also have to reflect modern technology. And I think there are, of course, developments on the horizon which will be coming into our field in the next couple of years. And of course, we are all scientists, and we are all of the most modern centers, and it was very difficult for us to decide which methods are we not showing. And we were very enthusiastic about new developments, but this is a semen manual for the basic procedures. So I think we had to take a very strong focus on giving this. But of course, the computerized analysis and the digital analysis of sperm samples is on the horizon, and it will be very interesting to see how these algorithms will change our work in the laboratories in the next couple of years. And with more and more better imaging and better algorithms to analyze these pictures, it will definitely be some adjustments in the 7th edition. There are new endpoints, we just discussed it. Some of them we included: DNA damage, motility patterns, channels and receptors are very important for sperm function. Currently, they are extra important methods which we can do in some specialized centers, but they will definitely also be coming as kits in a few years. And then it is a question of how do we want to incorporate those. And there are, of course, lots of molecular aspects on sperm, DNA integrity, membrane channels, motility patterns, which may also become very important in the next few years. So I think it is a very dynamic field. I'm looking forward to have new developments, and we will incorporate those when they are valid, when they are ready to go into a standard format.
Yes, and we actually, the new developments for the past 10 years, we had to look at them and see whether they are emerging or for research purposes, or actually we could already put them in the routine tests. So this is actually looking forward to the future, and we are looking for more developments, and which may give more impact for the next edition.
All right, Mario, it was very much fun talking to you, as always. It will be important now to let other people ask some questions and to have the audience and the users incorporated. So we give it back to Igor for the final session of this webinar.
Thank you.
Dear Mario, dear Stefan, thank you very much indeed for this fantastic session. Very innovative, and really personally enjoyed very much how we address the perspective of end users in terms of further use of this manual in the field for different purposes. And thank you very much indeed for underlining several aspects that we have to consider in terms of the technology development, particularly digital technology and development in the public health clinical medicine, that obviously should be considered in terms of use of this manual. And of course, we hope not upcoming, but the next edition of the manual, 7th edition of the manual, there are a lot of opportunities. And the questions about translation, use of the manual in different languages, it's extremely appropriate, and we, WHO, will try to do our best in order to translate the manual as it was done for the previous editions in the languages, in other languages, and we initiated the discussion with our partners, and we hope that these will be done progressively, starting first with the official UN languages, and then, as it was done for the 5th edition of the manual, in other languages as well. And probably some training materials that you listed also, we need to think about how to work on that and how to support and facilitate the use of the manual by clinicians, technicians, and researchers. So thank you once again for underlining all these issues in your fascinating talk. Thank you. So we are close to the end of our webinar. We have just few minutes. We have several questions from the audience, and we thank you all for generating these very important questions. As I mentioned at the beginning of the webinar, the time will not allow us to answer all questions, but we will compile all your questions in order to develop frequent asked questions sub-page to the manual web page, and we hope we will be able to do it very soon. But as we have few minutes, I would suggest that we will try to address some burning questions that were raised by the colleagues. I would like to raise these questions to our panelists. First of all, there were the questions about needs to clarify what is the differences between decision limits and just a moment, decision limits and references. So probably we can address this question first. And then there were a set of the questions related to the, just a moment, for example, about association relation between human semen and age, duration of abstinence before collection of the sample, association with smoking, alcohol, etc. As a risk factor, so as factors. So I would like to invite on panelists to address. Who would like to start first and reflect on this question?
The second question.
So probably the first question is about differences between limits.
Lars can answer.
I can answer that question. And to try to make it very short, a reference limit is based on data from a reference population. And it only defines the distribution of results from that reference population. It is mainly useful if the population is well defined. A decision limit takes it from another point of view. So we could say, an example, above which limit will we, so to say, never find men with hypogonadism? Or under which level are we likely to find those men who have an endocrine problem? Under which limit will it be possible to find karyotype abnormalities? Under which limit will we find Y chromosome microdeletions? So that is the decision limit. The reference limit is based on the reference population data. I hope that answers.
Thank you very much indeed, Lars. Whether other panelists would like to reflect on this, or we can try to answer a few additional questions about the effect of age or duration of abstinence before collection of sample. Probably the duration of abstinence before collection of sample. Any reflection on that? Lars?
Yeah. I saw the question, and the question was if the age of the patient should be in the report, but I would say that should be in the, because the birth date of the patient should be in the report. Mm-hmm. But the abstinence time is also important, and I would say it's the most practical time to record. Many patients can perhaps, many men can remember the last time they had an ejaculation, but it's more about, does this man have frequent ejaculations, or he was told to have 3 days abstinence time before this sample, and then he had 3 months before that. That will actually affect the samples too, but it's not practical to have men to have a diary and pick in every time they ejaculate. That would be very disrespectful. But I agree, and that is also suggested that that should be in the report form. How many days since the most previous ejaculation?
Thank you. Thank you very much indeed, Lars. In terms of saving our time, I would suggest that other questions, because they were really quite often asked during the webinar, and we received the similar questions before, that we will try to formulate our answers in the frequent asked questions, and we will consult it with the editorial board of the 6th edition and other technical partners who are working with us on this project, on this manual. So by having said this, I would like once again to reiterate and confirm that this webinar is recorded and will be made available on the WHO webpage. We hope it will be done very soon, because we received some questions about the availability of this webinar being recorded. As well, I would like to project our final slide. Yes, so the manual itself, because we received the questions about where the manual can be accessed. So this is the web link to the 6th edition of the manual. You can just use the proposed link or using QR code that you see on the slide. And through this, you can access the 6th edition of the manual, 2 versions available. It's online version, which is slightly different in terms of how to use from the PDF version, because if you would like to have the printed version, you can also access the PDF version and print this document. So it's just regarding these questions. And finally, I have a great pleasure to thank our distinguished panelists for their fantastic, very comprehensive, clear presentations and talk about the topic of our webinar, about the role of this manual in the field of the sexual and reproductive health, and particularly about the 6th edition of the manual, which is now in live available. I would like to thank all colleagues from WHO who supported and helped us with the setting up this webinar and the preparatory work for the launch of the manual through different channels. You probably, if you are using Tweet, it was quite intensive tweeting process regarding the manual since earlier today. And of course, all of you, our participants, for your attention, for your question, for your interest in this document. As once again, the document is in live. We really hope that it will be very useful for your daily work, for your clinical work, for your research. So please use our website, look at the updates, and we hope that again, the document will be very, very useful for you. Once again, thank you very much to everyone. We wish you all the best in your professional and personal life. Stay well and keep safe.